Truly grateful to be in the meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm grateful to be standing up here to be able to introduce our speaker tonight. And a little bit about myself: I been in and out of the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous for a good amount of years and stuff like that. So this time when I came around, I had a little bit of not so much hope. I came in for my first three meetings drunk and and not thinking that I was going to be able to get sober because it hadn't worked in the past. And then on the third night, I was in a meeting and I heard this gentleman share, and he shared, his experience, strength, and hope. And it's something that caught my attention. That on that fourth day, that fourth meeting, I came in sober. And for that, I'm truly grateful. I never shared that with him, but that's what happened. And he's been a great since then. He's continued to see me after the meeting. They share some experience with me. And finally, I got enough courage to ask him to be my sponsor. And for that, I'm truly grateful. And a funny story about him. Um, well, about us. When we were doing my fourth step work, before we got into the fifth, we were sitting at a coffee shop, doing this, and I had to get this thing that I've been holding on to for a good amount of years that was really bothering me, and I that I've never shared with anybody before, but I had to get it off my chest. I started crying, in the middle of this coffee shop, and it was quite full. It almost made it look like, he was breaking up with me. And he still stuck around, and for that experience, it kind of humbled me, and I'm sure it probably humbled him a little bit, but I'm grateful for that experience. He's a man of integrity. He practices every single side of that triangle, and then it's been an honor to be his sponsee. He's helped me to understand the big book, in a way that I could, I could actually understand it. So, it's an honor to be able to introduce him today. And let's all welcome Wes. Yeah.
My name's Wes. I'm an alcoholic, and I'm not really sure who he's talking about, but apparently it's me. I'm already sweating through all my clothes here, so I'm gonna try to make it through this thing. My sobriety anniversary is May 3rd of 2022. Um, that was not my first go around though, unfortunately. But my story starts. I was born in Chicago. My family was there till I was about 5 years old. I didn't know many of my grandparents or other relatives, and I didn't really know much about my family history. After that, we ended up in Cleveland, Ohio, and I was there till I was about 12. Um, and then we moved to Missoula, Montana. And it was interesting because one thing about this little town I grew up in called Chagrin Falls, Ohio, is I used to be so resentful for the longest time that we moved to Montana that if we hadn't moved to Montana, I wouldn't have become an alcoholic. Um, I found out, a number of years later, that little town in Ohio had an absolute heroin pandemic go through it. So, I look at things very, very differently these days. And I look at that almost as an act of God that he got me away from that because, if it wasn't alcoholism or alcohol, it would have been something else. You know, from a pretty young age, I was uncomfortable in my skin, especially around age 12. And I had teachers and different people, trying to convince my family and myself that there was something wrong with me. And I fought that idea for a long, long time. I did everything possible to prove to myself and to everybody around me that I was normal, um, without any idea what normal was. It took so much so to the extent that, in eighth grade, I was sticking pills in the side of my mouth, even though my parents would watch me take them, and I would spit them out after they would leave. And I did that for an entire year, made the honor roll and all these other things. And they had this big celebration about the therapy and the pills and everything. And I got to ruin everybody's party and tell them that I'd been spitting those things out for a whole year. Um, just always just self-will one riot from a young age. And then when high school came around, I was completely introverted. I was an introvert that was just desperate to be extroverted. Um, freshman year was pretty tough. You know, I didn't really drink at that point or anything like that. I had a real small core group of friends. We were total nerds. We were on the golf team. I played violin. Um, I was I wanted to be away from that idea that I had made up of myself for so badly. And I wore sweater vests. My hair was parted to the side. Um, my mom pretty much still dressed me at that time. Um, you know, and speaking of my family again, you know, I came from a great family. My parents did amazing. We grew up in an upper middle class household, but you know, the way that I was raised, you know, broke me from a lot of the things that it takes to have a relationship and be out in the public because you know, I didn't know that it was different. Wasn't normal for parents to sleep in separate wings of the house. You know, I didn't know that families use the word love. I don't recall ever hearing the word love in my life. And that's something I got to have a good conversation with my mother about a few years ago. And, you know, she adamantly denied it for a long, long time. And then finally got to realize that, hey, her growing up too, there was no embraces, there was no hugs. Um, so, you know, my idea of relationships and things like that was pretty broken from a pretty young age. You know, and then somewhere around sophomore year, you know, I had my first beer and I couldn't stand the thing. You know, I didn't want anything to do with it. You know, I would dump some of them out on the side when people weren't watching, so it looked like that I drank some. But you know, somewhere around that time, I had my first drunk, and everything changed from that point. You know, all my insecurities, all my fears, everything were gone. I could finally talk to a girl. I could finally walk down the hallway. But, you know, I was that guy that, you know, was just absolutely wild on the weekends, and then I would walk around with my head down in the hallway and just be afraid of everything. You know, fear is a big part of my story. You know, and pretty quickly, you know, it was never, there was no drinky poo for me. It was always just straight to it. You know, the way I was taught was, you know, you go to a kegger party, you're there to get fucked up. That's what we do. You know, in short order, you know, I found my solution. And, you know, I didn't drink during the weekdays or anything like that at that time, but, you know, it's all that I thought about all week long. I was planning the party, figuring out how to get to the booze, you name it. And then it was just full bore once the weekend would come. Um, you know, golf was always a really big thing for me. I took it really, really serious. My goal and ambition in life was to always be a PGA Tour golfer or be a club pro, something like that. And, you know, one of the rules I always had for myself is that I wouldn't smoke pot, I wouldn't drink or anything like that when I was on that golf course. It was like my safe place. And I spent a lot of time there because I needed a safe place. And, you know, coming out of high school, I got a scholarship offer to go down to Walla Walla Community College and get a professional golf and turf management degree. And you know, I had a buddy that graduated with me that was 2 years older than me that looked pretty similar to me. So I had his ID and I went down there and I felt like the king of the campus. I was able to buy booze, all these other things. And, you know, driving drunk is a big part of my story. It's just something we did from a young age and, you know, never really had any consequences. But at age 20, I was coming back from the baseball team's party. The Oregon border was really close, and I'd never heard of DUI check stops before. So I pulled through one of those, pretty cocky and confident. And next thing you know, I'm being booked into jail. And, you know, my family had told me for a long time that, you know, if you ever got a DUI, you ever found yourself in jail, you know, we don't exist anymore. Um, so I didn't bother to call anybody or anything like that. And it's kind of funny. You know, I woke up the next morning and my jail cell opened and this giant Aryan Nation guy was standing in my cell. And I was just like, well, we might as well just get it over with. And the guy looked at me and he had just the squeakiest little voice ever. And he said, "Hey, new guy, come get some breakfast." So, holy shit. And so that scared the hell out of me, but not enough. You know, and a couple guys from the golf team came and bailed me out. And the golf coach found out pretty quickly and terminated me from the team. And I didn't know what I was going to do. You know, I got just a slap on the hat on that one. My parents came through, got me a lawyer. You know, they pretty much said, "Hey, you know, don't get in trouble again. This thing will fall off your record eventually." So, you know, at that point, I was still a weekend drinker, but thinking about it all the time. You know, the idea of being an alcoholic or having a problem hadn't even crossed my mind. And I was looking for another opportunity to continue my golf career and try to get an education. I had a lot of scholarship offers around the country, but Montana Tech over in Butte was the only one that offered me a full ride. And the number one reason I took that scholarship was because Butte, Montana was the drinking capital of the USA. You know, at that time, they were the only place that didn't have an open container law. Drinking was cheap. It was accepted. You could drink and drive. My good buddy over there, his dad was the chief of police. I mean, I figured I had it made. And the minute I got there, I turned 21, I found a bartending job as fast as I could. And I embraced the alcoholic lifestyle as quickly as I could. And, I tried to look for similarities back then because I saw these just brilliant people, these engineers, these scientists that I thought were drinking and doing things just like me. But what I didn't realize is, they weren't pre-gaming like I was. They weren't drinking afterward like I was. They weren't having the troubles in their life like I was. But somehow, I kept managing to make it to class and things like that. But, after about that first year, I became a day drinker and started drinking almost every day when I could. I've got a famous plaque on one of the bars there in Butte because I never actually got a paycheck. They had to give me something. So they would give me these paychecks for 1 cent. And they framed them all for me because there was dozens of them. Because all my paychecks went to cover my bar tabs, and usually those weren't enough either. So yeah, there's a bar in Butte. You might find that if you're moseying around. But consequences started coming. Shortly after that, I got myself a DUI again, and but this time, being in Butte, all those things I talked about, the chief of police buddy, and all this, that, and the other, even the golf coach, brought me in to see this particular judge. And I walked in, the guy put his shit kickers up on the table and he said, "We're going to get you out of this. Tell me about yourself." And I had to do a double take. And 48 hours later, I wasn't being charged with DUI anymore. And that was one of the biggest enabling things that sent me on my way to pure alcoholism. Um, just that lack of consequences. It was still just a lot of fun for me. I around that time frame, life started to get pretty real too. My parents decided to get a separation. My dad lost his career, and the gal that I thought I was going to marry at the time, she went through a miscarriage. So next thing I know, I was drinking all the time. I wasn't making my commitments anymore. I think I was the top 5 in the country at that point for the NAIA for golf, and I was so hungover one morning, woke up at some random place, I didn't even know where I was at, and realized that I had missed the bus to Utah. So I hopped in my old rickety Suburban and went as fast as it possibly could. And I caught up to the bus halfway to Utah, just drunk. I had a change of clothes in my golf bag, and that was it. And I pulled up in the wrong lane. I was flagging down the bus, and they finally pulled over, and I just left my fucking Suburban in the middle of nowhere, Idaho, and hopped on the bus. Yeah, we got down there and he demoted me to number 7 guy instead of the 1 guy like I'd been playing, and I thought that embarrassment and things like that would help me change, thought all the things that had just been happening would help me change, but it only just kept me going. And Utah was kind of a big awakening for me because I went down to the bar that night because I was one of the only guys that was able to drink. And I remember I ordered a double something, and the guy looked at me and he said, "I can't pour that for you." And I said, "Man, I haven't even had a drink yet. What do you mean you can't pour that for me?" And after arguing with this bartender for like 5 minutes, he finally told me that in Utah, they can't pour doubles, that he could pour me a sidecar and I could pour it in myself. And I said, "Well, line all those that up then." I drank like 7 beers, 8 beers, and didn't really feel anything. And then realized that their alcohol content was less. And that was probably the first time that I realized, like, holy shit, like I am just drinking, and I can't get enough. But that still wasn't enough. And then one of the bigger blows is, NAIA does things a little bit differently with your eligibility requirements. It starts the day you enroll in college, not so much the day you started playing sports. So I found out my senior year that I was no longer going to be allowed to play. And that was like my whole motivation to life at that point, between drinking, going to school, anything. So they made me the assistant coach and let me keep my scholarship so I could finish up school. I got some assistance money and things like that. I had like $4,000 and I thought, oh, I'm good. This will get me through the semester. I paid like a month's of rent and that money was gone in like 2 weeks. Managed to get fired from another bartending job over there. And next thing you know, I was pretty much homeless with 1 semester left to go, drinking every single day. I had the bright idea that the bar that fired me, I still had the keys to the front door. So I would go steal the Shake-A-Day pot and grab a couple bottles of Jameson while I was in there. And my higher power's been watching over me for a long time, because I went down there and I opened up that front door and realized, like, these guys have fucking cameras and stuff. What am I doing? So the smart alcoholic I was said, okay, I won't take the money. I just grabbed a couple bottles of Jameson and locked the door behind me. The doors to those, the locks to those doors were changed the very next day. Obviously, they felt sympathy enough for me. They saw me in those cameras just grabbing 2 bottles of booze. But, at that time, I was going to the food bank. I was sleeping on a couch, and I was just trying to get by. I wasn't barely eating. I was just drinking all the time. And, I left Montana Tech University with one class left to finish. And it's still something that just eats me up to this day, that I actually did pretty well over there, even though the alcoholism was full bore at that point. So I came back to Missoula, and within a couple weeks, I got another DUI. Drinking was all that I thought about. I didn't care about work. I didn't care about anything. I just wanted to drink. As long as I had $100 in my pocket, I knew that I could go out and get absolutely annihilated. I was always a barroom drunk for the most part. Because, for me, alcohol was the way that, I was able to interact with people and be social and actually have a good time, because I couldn't do that just as me. At that point, they charged me with a second offense, because they brought back up that one from when I was 20 in Washington, because the time hadn't gone by enough yet. I had a leg monitor on, all these different things, but it didn't matter. Nothing was going to stop me from drinking. People have probably heard it before, but at that point, I was still going out to the bars. I was still doing stuff. I would pack a thing of Oscar Mayer bologna with me all the time, and I would put that lunch meat in between my leg monitor, and I would change it out every so often. I joke about it, but at the end of the night, sometimes I'd be drunk enough that I would start eating some of the lunch with it. Yeah. I would drink in between every breathalyzer blow. I would use fake urine. I even used a fake penis one time. The lengths that I went to continue my drinking are just unbelievable to me these days. What I went through, and the pain and the suffering, just to continue, because another person says it too, but I had to maintain a level of drunkenness at about that point just to feel even slightly normal. There's a guy that used to say, I had to get drunk just to pretend that I was sober out in public. And that's kind of where I was at that point. So, I was just about to be done with probation on that one. And I'd been at the old Lucky Strike bowling alley the night before. And I thought I was much more clever than all these people. So I didn't actually go into the bar. I stayed in the bowling alley, but I was giving my buddies my debit card. And of course, I got drunk and forgot to get my debit card back. So, the nice folks over at the Lucky Strike put a Facebook post up and said, does anybody know Wes Southard? He left his debit card at the bar here. So I got a call from the probation officer to come on in and see him. And I still thought I had him whooped, because it'd been a couple days. But around that time is when they started being able to, urine test and go back for like 72 hours. So I got slapped with a good dose of humble pie on that one, and they hit me with almost another year of probation. But again, still didn't matter. Nothing was going to stop me unless I was blacked out or dead. I was just going to continue drinking, because I was the kind of guy, even when they would make me do the little stints in jail for those DUIs, I would find guys that were making Pruno and shit, even in the jail. It didn't matter. I was going to find a way to feel different. So, a couple of years went by here in Missoula, where I was just kind of bouncing around. I was working 3 different jobs, had no ambition, no desire. I managed to get off that probation by being the sneaky, manipulative alcoholic that I was, even though I was drinking the entire time. And then, I managed to find a pretty good career, and I made some success for myself. And at that, and because of that, I was able to start drinking exactly how I wanted to. I had the income now and the freedom. I wasn't on paper anymore. And I drank like a fish, and I drank like a high class fish. I was at Jaker's every night, or the Mustard Seed, or whatever it was, hanging out with all the country club guys, just trying to be somebody that I wasn't. I was always wearing a mask. I was always telling little white lies, changing the golf score by 1 digit, or telling a little bit different story on the hunting trip, or the snowboarding jump was a little bit bigger than it was, things that were just completely irrelevant. But that's how my whole life was. I'd been working this career for a few years, and, I hadn't started getting any of the real physical things quite yet. I wasn't dry heaving in the mornings or shaking violently quite yet, but it was coming. And I had this goal in my life that by age 30, I wanted to be a homeowner. I wanted to be a dad. I wanted to be married, and I was going to make that happen no matter what. Um, so I met a gal who already had a couple of kids, and she drank just like I did. And we had a lot of fun for a while. Um, and then when she got pregnant, I thought for sure, this is becoming a dad is what's going to make me change. This is what's going to do it for me. And I truly believe that. And for the first time, I wanted to get sober, but it wasn't for me. It was because I was becoming something. Something was coming into my life. And, I'm the kind of drunk though, that, while she was in the natural birthing center, I couldn't handle what was going on. So I ran down to the bar to get a couple drinks, and I missed his actual birth by about 2 minutes. But my alcoholic brain said, hey, you missed everything except for that one little part. In short order, though, that little boy had to be rushed to the NICU, and I'm going to try to not shed tears here, but, and they said, we think he has meningitis, and we don't know what kind. And being a first-time dad, I didn't know how to take that. They're talking about doing a spinal tap on him, and then he might have cerebral palsy and all these other things. So I'm hooked up with all these tubes. I lost it, and I left the hospital with my girlfriend, my son, and I got shit-faced drunk, and I don't remember any of it. Apparently, I got pulled over in her minivan, covered head to toe in Taco Bell, and the cop said, how fast you were going, and me, still just my ego. I said, maybe 80, and he said 115, and I looked at him just stone-faced, apparently, and said, minivans don't go 115, bud. And I thought for sure with that birth of my son, that DUI, that would be the turning point. And by the way, that little boy turned out to be happy and healthy. He's sitting in that room behind me. He's my best little friend. I was the worst dry drunk I've ever seen. I made it like 2 weeks, and I was insane. I would drink in between everything, just like I was doing before. I would hide it constantly. I made a deal with his mom, about how much I could drink and when I could drink and all these other things. And again, just the amount of effort I put into continuing that drinking was just unbelievable to me. I still hadn't thought of myself as an alcoholic or anything like that. Nobody had called me an alcoholic, and it's probably because I always surrounded myself with people that drank and lived like I did. Not too long after that, they all had enough. I was so angry. I had no idea how to live, and my solution to life wasn't freely available to me because I was trying to manage it. There was times when I would hide empty cans and things like that in the kids' toy chests, and eventually people would find the things, and just the looks of shame and embarrassment, and thinking that nobody knew what was going on, thinking my job didn't know what was going on. So they all ended up leaving, and I drank even harder. Kept drinking. We were in Lolo at that point, and I managed to convince her to get back together. We moved back to Missoula and got a little house, which ironically, it's a big part of my story, that little house. It's 2 doors down from the early sunrise meeting. And we lasted about 6 more months. And when he was about 6, 7 months old, they pieced out for good. At that point is when my body, my mind, everything started completely shutting down. At that point, I don't think I'd been to the doctor or a dentist or anything like that in 8, 9 years. And I kind of just convinced myself that this thing is going to take me out at some point, and it's just going to be a matter of when and how. I was afraid that my teeth were all destroyed, that, I wouldn't be able to afford to do anything, that I was going to find out I had some disease that I didn't even want to know about. Because again, just trying to do everything I possibly could to convince myself that I was normal, that everything was okay with me. And day drinking, it turned into an all-day thing. And COVID came around, and I became more than just a bar drinker at that point. I started bringing it home with me, and I was to the point where every morning, I would wake up so viciously hungover, dry heaving, puking up blood, shaking violently. And I mentioned that little house, and for years I couldn't figure out what all these people were doing, parking all around my house every day. And it would make me so angry, especially a guy who I really, really respect. His name's Tony. He drives this red pickup truck, and he would park across the street from my house every day. And then he would skip across the street. I said, I'm going to shoot this guy one more time, or I'm going to let my German Shepherd out. Something. At that same time, there was a guy named Greg who I absolutely admire. And, for years, he also parked exactly on the side of my house every single day. And no matter what, my dogs would go out and just be ravaging at him through the fence and trying to get him. And he would wave to me every single day. And then he would walk down the alley. And I was like, what the fuck is that guy doing? Like, these church people are really crazy. So, I again managed to talk my son's mom into kind of starting over again. We didn't move back in together or anything, and things were going downhill at work. The only reason I kept my job is because I was the number one sales guy in 7 different stores in 6 different states, and they couldn't fire me. Even though they knew I was hungover, they knew my life was unmanageable. I was always calling in sick, never actually used a sick day for actually being sick. Finally, I was kind of seeing a girl on the side too. Finally, she had some experience with NA, and she had told me about this Alcoholics Anonymous. And, I said, oh, I've seen what that is. I saw the movie Fight Club. I'm good. And she said, no, just go to it and, take what you need and leave all the rest. And looking back, that was the worst advice for a guy like me. We came back from the lake that day, and I remember I was just shaking violently, and it was like a half empty lime White Claw. I chugged that, and the thing was like 90 degrees just to try to make the shakes go away. And I looked at this meeting list that I'd found online, and I saw that there was one at the Providence. And I walked all around that building, pounding on doors, looking to try to get in this meeting. And it turned out that meeting had like closed up or something. So luckily, with the sobriety in Missoula, I saw that there was an 8 o'clock at night meeting. So her and I went down to that meeting, and for the first time in my life, in particular because of a lady named Sid back there, I got to hear all these things that I was doing. I was not this unique person. I got to hear about all these other people drinking like I did, and the thinking and the behaviors and the lengths they'd gone to continue their drinking. And finally, for the first time in my life, I could relate, because even after all those DUIs and all the different things and outpatient treatments, you name it, I always looked for the differences a lot of the times, because they would lump me in with people that had drug problems or this problem or that problem. And very rarely was there anybody in there that had a drinking problem like I did. I also manipulated the system lots of times too. I did almost all of my treatment and things like that at the Native American Center, because I knew how much easier it was to manipulate those folks and get through those programs. But yeah, that first meeting it was huge for me. I finally knew that, hey, this place might be able to help me. I still was not anywhere close to being able to say I was an alcoholic. And the second half of that first step, there was no way. My life was not unmanageable. On paper, it looked fantastic. I had the white picket fence house and the trucks and the toys and the family. And, so I decided to try to do this thing, but all I was going to do was go to meetings. I wasn't going to do any of this other stuff. That's for you guys. I'm going to take this part. And, they talk about how if you're getting sober for anything else besides those are all the first things that are going to leave you in your life. And that was most certainly my case. I made it 3 months as a dry drunk, just going to meetings. I wish somebody would have told me what a dry drunk was before that, because I had no idea. I thought for sure that if I quit drinking, that was my problem. That was my only problem, that I had life whooped besides that. And boy, was I wrong. They talk about all the yets yet. When I came in that first time around, I wasn't in any legal trouble. I had a job. Me and my son's mom were kind of slowly working on things. Everything was still okay. 3 months later, as soon as I found out that relationship was not going to come back, that my job was on the fringes and all these things and the other, I found myself with a bottle of Jameson right back in my hand. And we talk about progressive and things like that. It's like those 3 months didn't even happen. I was instantly blackout drunk. Again, there was no drink or two for me. It was as good as drunk as I possibly could. And in short order, I pretty much woke up one day and realized that I'd lost my career. The family was completely gone. I had a protection order against me. And I got a felony DUI. And that felony DUI, I started coming back to meetings again, but I was drunk at each one. I was even sharing, drunk as fuck, and thought I was fooling people at the meetings even. Um, I don't even remember that night. I remember talking to Angela that night and a gal named Lucy, and that's about it. Um, so that next morning when I came to, and the realization started to hit me, and they told me that I was being charged with felony DUI. I'm sitting there arguing with the judge over a video monitor, still drunk, telling him how did we go from 2 to 4. Well, the statute of limitations and things like that have changed, with the look back periods. They used to only be able to look back 5 years, then it was 10 years. And once you get to a second offense, they look back for life. So it was the real deal. It was felony DUI this time. So for some reason, the judge let me out on an OR without a bond. And I got home, and I'm so grateful for those 3 months that I attended AA, even though I didn't do anything besides attend, because I had a head full of AA. That drinking, that little bit of drinking I did afterward was miserable. So I had a big book at that time that I'd never opened, and I had lots of guns. And I found myself hallucinating, sweating, and I was holding the gun and a big book, and I didn't know what to do. I really wanted to take my own life. And I don't know if it was a hallucination or a spiritual experience or what, but something got me to open up that big book that day. And I came back into a meeting full of shame and guilt. I didn't want anybody to know that I'd gotten a felony DUI. I still wanted to hold the masks up. I still wanted people to think that I had this good life, that I was this good guy, that I had things under control, which was the furthest thing from the truth. But I decided that I was going to try to sit all the way down in this thing. All I could think about was, how am I going to support myself? I'm going to go to prison. I don't have a job now. I'm not going to be able to pay any of my bills. My dad came over and instantly, was wrapping up all my shit, and, put my dogs up for rehoming. I thought my life was over. I couldn't see the kids at that point. I really didn't feel like I had anything to live for, but I had this head full of AA. And it was like we've heard before, it was the last house in the block for me. I'd burned every bridge there was. I was so isolated. So, I came back into these meetings. I asked a man to sponsor me right away. And I was dead serious about this stuff. And that guy I owe so much to this day. He led me through the first 3 steps. But the problem with an alcoholic like me is, I'm always just looking for that instant gratification. I'm just looking for that relief and just enough of it so I can go back and take my will back. So when I got through that 3rd step, I followed this complete stranger, didn't know his last name. I followed him about 2 miles back to Rattlesnake. No idea where we were going. And, we got to this little creek, and, he had told me to memorize that 3rd step prayer. And we got down on our knees and we did this thing. And nothing happened right then and there, but shortly afterward, everything started to change. And like I said, unfortunately for me, all that relief I found from the 3rd step and doing that with that man and turning my will over, finally having faith in something, I decided that, I didn't need to continue going in these steps. And a lot of my self-will came back to me. And, I started making up excuses for why I was late or why I couldn't make it, and that man fired me. I was so upset. I was so angry with him. I thought I was going to fight him at the zoo group. And he couldn't have been more stone-faced and just honest. He said, "Hey, Wes, it's not going to work out. I think it's best you work with somebody else." He didn't give me any excuses or any reasons or anything like that. And looking back, I'm so glad that's how it went down. So, I instantly asked another guy to sponsor me, and, I found myself doing the exact same things. I did not have the courage, that principle for the 4th step, to look at myself, my innermost self, and, and to dive into those things that searching and fearless moral inventory. No way. There was things I was taking to the grave with me. There was things that nobody was going to find out. Nobody could know how I actually felt about myself. Because like we've heard a lot about, it's especially with men, we bottle all these things up. I don't remember ever seeing my father cry once in my entire life, or sharing any type of emotions. And speaking of family again, my parents didn't drink at all. And I always looked at those differences again, that how can I be an alcoholic? My brother, my sister don't drink, my dad, my mom don't drink. Well, I got to find out that my parents were complete alcoholic drug addicts. And although my parents didn't drink and my brother and sister didn't drink, they had tons of alcoholic behaviors. Um, so, it doesn't, they say sometimes it can skip generations, but I'm also convinced that even if there's no history of alcoholism in your family, you can turn into one. There's all different ways to become an alcoholic, but I kind of had both going for me. So got fired by another sponsor because same thing. I was making excuses. I would show up without the work done. And again, the guy couldn't have been any more humble about it. He said, Wes, I think it's best you work with somebody else. And man, it was another devastating blow for me. And I could not figure out why I was getting fired by these sponsors. Like, I'm going to meetings, I'm meeting up with you. I wasn't accountable. I wasn't being honest, and I wasn't being honest, especially with myself. Then there was another sponsor, same exact deal. So next thing I know, I found myself at a year sober, still only through the third step, and shit started hitting the fan. Co-parenting started going horrible. Things weren't working out really well in life. And I had to really realize that alcohol was just but a symptom of my problems. And I found the sponsor that I have currently, right at that year mark of sobriety. And he was the first one that I didn't choose. It was at the Bonner Park meeting, which was probably one of my most saving grace meetings, because between noon and 7, 8 o'clock, there really wasn't much going on for AA, and 3 to 5 o'clock in the afternoon was kind of my send-off point. So that 4 o'clock in the afternoon Bonner Park meeting was huge for me. And my sponsor, his name is Greg Monroe, and he attended that meeting regularly. And a gal kind of threw me at him one day and said, "Hey, you're working with this man here." And of course, at first I was like, "Oh, this guy was the dean of the law school. He can get me out of my felony DUI." That was my first thinking. And I'm so grateful that this gentleman told me, right off the bat, that I'm here to help you with your alcohol problem. I will not be in court with you. I will not be advising you. I will not be doing any of those things, but I'm here to help you find a different life and to have sobriety. And again, so grateful for that. The guy's been just unbelievable in my life. So, I sat all the way down with him finally at that point, and we started back at step one. I tried so hard to convince him that, I'm already through step 3. And he said, no. Not only are we going to start back at step 1, but here's the deal. Once you get through these steps and work this program, the deal is that you will start working with another man and give these things back that were so freely given to you. And of course I said yes, but in the back of my mind, I was like, yeah, not doing that. I never planned on working these steps once, let alone twice, or leading any other men through this program. Sitting down with him and doing that 4-step to the best of my ability, which I had a hard time with that phrase, best of my ability, because I beat the shit out of myself about that my whole entire life. Like, am I doing the best of my ability? Is there more that I can do? And, I just got to put the pencil to paper and just let it write. Just realize that whatever happened in that moment was the best of my ability. That I can always come back later and do these things. But I got to see myself finally, and actually get some courage that I thought I had so long, but it was always, the bottle that gave it to me. And then I got to that 5th step with him, and, there was a couple things that I thought for sure I could never, ever disclose, talk about, things that had happened to me or I'd done. And, after doing that with him, I thought that 3rd step gave me some relief. Holy shit, I'd been carrying around this burden and this weight on my shoulders for so long. 6 and 7, we kind of breezed over a little bit that first time around. And those are some crucial steps. I would highly recommend, at least in my experience, staying in those for a little while. Got to the list of people I'd harmed and making amends. There was a lot of people that were going to take some time. The damage was so significant, things like that I had to wait on some of the crucial ones. But as I started doing those more and more and more, again, the relief just kept coming. My life started to get better. I found myself in a relationship. They always talk about how should wait till you're sober for a year before you get into a relationship. And I sentiment that, but I would also say that you should wait to a year and have worked the steps. Um, I was about halfway through them or so when I got into that relationship. And one of the things that I'm most ashamed of to this day is that woman was the love of my life. And I didn't tell her about my felony DUI. I was pretty convinced that it was going to go away. I thought I had a plea bargain on the table. Um, and I let it go like that for 4 months, to the point where she was losing her shit, thinking that I was cheating on her. She knew something was going on. And finally I disclosed it to her, and she kind of looked at me like, Jesus, that's what's going on. And it put a giant rift in our relationship. I came into that completely just unhonest. Um, After getting through the rest of these steps, uh, life really got a lot better. Our relationship started to get better. I still was not practicing these principles in all of my affairs, though. I was still wearing masks. I still didn't want anybody to know about my felony DUI. I didn't want people to know how things really were. So, about a year ago, her and I broke up, and I was at just an absolute low point in my life, feeling suicidal. And this program is just amazing, because anytime I'm feeling poor me, anytime shit's going on in my life, like the Hand of AA reaches out in the strangest ways I could ever imagine. And men like Adrian and two other men started asking me to sponsor them. I started to be asked to speak and things like that. And I really got scared, because I got asked to speak at the Solution Group, and I was a week out from being sentenced for my felony DUI. And I did not want to speak, because I wanted to do it after that. I wanted to tell this victory story about all these things. But my sponsor said, no, people need to hear your story before you get sentenced, how you're staying sober doing this. So I got up there and somehow did that. And then a week later, I went into court 11 months ago. So I was 2 years sober. I walked into my sentencing for felony DUI with no clue of what was going to happen to me. And about 12, 15 people from AA, half of which I didn't even know, showed up. They waited around for 4 hours until it was my turn. And I prepared my things. I thought I was going to prison. The judge happened to be my same judge for my parenting plan, for the protection order, and for my felony DUI. Like, how that happens, you get the same judge. So this guy knew me in and out. He knew everything I was doing. On a lucky note, my sponsor just happened to be that judge's teacher, which is kind of a cool thing. And they joke about it still to this day. But I walked out of that room with a $250 fine. Should have been 10,000, and I was given a 5-year opportunity to find a treatment court in lieu of going to the watch program, going to prison. And I had a public defender. So if you're anybody going through the legal process, felonies or whatever it is, you don't necessarily have to have a lawyer or anything like that. You got to do the next right indicated thing and change your life. But this judge saw everything I was doing. Recently, I've completed that felony sentence. And I hope here in about 3 weeks, I'm going to be discharged off paper, which would be pretty amazing. The biggest highlight of my entire AA career has been working with these other men. I used to hate it when people would say that, I get more out of this than the sponsee does. I understand where it's coming from. Giving this thing back, that step 12, the service has changed everything in my life. I worked with a couple guys early on that just wouldn't stop drinking, wouldn't get through the first step. Leading these guys through all 12 steps. I got 2 guys, including Adrian, that are about to hit a year. And it's just unbelievable, the miracles when we sit all the way down this thing. I did the steps again about a year ago in with them and with my sponsor. And, this is not a one-time deal. I thought I would do those steps one time and be good and cured. The promises started coming true in my life. But man, if I'm not actively engaged in this thing, those promises start to fade away. My alcoholic thinking starts to come back. So I've got to be active in this thing and giving this thing back at all times. But reworking those steps revealed so much more to me that I couldn't even remember. Things from my childhood, things from my active drinking. And I've been able to peel back so many more layers of the onion and just realize all these other things about me. And, and finally had found a way to live. You know, I feel like I'm a 21-year-old kid right now. I started drinking so young and shut off all my mental abilities. So, how much time do we have? A couple minutes. Okay, sorry. You know, all in all, this thing is an absolute miracle. I was a doomed alcoholic. I was one of those people that I thought was constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. It took a lot. You know, I was crying just last night. I'm a big country music fan, and I was listening to this Tim McGraw song. You know, he's talking about how I'm not an angel, you know, that I've still got demons in the closet, things like that. I'm not as good as I'm gonna be, but I'm better than I used to be. And that's kind of where I'm at here. You know, there's lots more to be revealed. You know, I hold on to that sentiment of don't kill yourself in the first 5 years because you'd be killing a stranger. But in 3.5 years, the changes that I've seen in myself, my thinking, you know, those promises, the situations that used to baffle us, the anger, the anxiety, all those things without taking a pill or going to a therapist, just sitting all the way down in this thing. I'll say that outside help is something that would benefit me and a lot of people, but this program, more than anything, has given me a completely new life. Things are still really, really hard. I can still be an asshole at times, but I'm aware of it now. I was never aware of any of my behaviors or my thinking, and I'm able to do something different. You know, and that same guy, Tony, he told me at the beginning, you know, I said, I just want a better life, a better life. And he said, no, man, nobody's going to promise you anything better, but you'll get a different life. You know, for me, anything different was better. I got that little boy back there. I got people that call me. I get invited to different things now. My dad wants to see me. Um, I owe everything to this program. I don't know what else to say. Thank you, guys.
Thank